Hello everybody and welcome back to another video. Today I'm going to be doing another what if video in Wings of Fire. What if Kestrel chose to save Sky instead of Peril? This video idea was given to me as a patron choice by my newest patron, Oretrix. This is honestly the most fun I've ever had writing a what if, and I hope you guys enjoy what I've come up with. I will clarify this now. Some events in the story have been slightly altered, that way I could take some creative liberty. This is an alternate universe after all, so some things are going to be different. I've decided to split this up into 2 parts, and towards the end of the video, you'll see what I mean by creating a sequel. Seriously, things are going to get crazy, and I'm going to be touching entirely new ground in the Wings of Fire series, so you are going to want to stick around until the end. Also, before I start the video, huge shout out to my patrons! Crazy Roblox Man, LordIsopod, DarkLover95, Springtail Productions, 3 Moons, and Oretrix. Thank you so much for supporting me. Links to their social medias are in the description down below. Anyways, without further ado, let's get into the video. Kestrel was running for her life. More so, flying the opposite direction of the exact dragon that wished to kill her. Queen Scarlet of the Skywings. She hissed at her with furious rage, an entire troop of soldiers flying by her side. Kestrel barely dodged the fire that was being shot in her direction, even feeling its heat sizzle the underside of her wing. And they were so close to catching her. But yet, in that moment, Kestrel couldn't help herself but to reminisce upon the best day of her life, the day her dragonets were hatched. Because, hidden near some bushes on the border of the Sky Kingdom, 2 nearly born dragonets sat, unaware of what was to come. Rather than them needing her, she needed them. But it wasn't something Kestrel would ever admit to. She even struggled to tell if that was what she was feeling. Tears began to well up in her eyes as she closed them, allowing the memory of their hatching to play clear in her mind. It was the only thing she clung to as she flew, desperate and enraged. The Skywings guarding the hatchery said that Kestrel's eggs were cursed. When she looked into the baby blue eyes of her first hatched dragonet, all she saw was innocence. He's perfect, she thought to herself. For a moment she even chose to ignore how tiny he was in comparison to the other newborn Skywings she had seen, and how much weaker his build seemed to be. Instead, she found her heart yearning to hold him, to protect him from anything the world could ever do to him. It was a feeling Kestrel had never felt before in her life, but one she didn't mind. The odd little dragonet weakly stumbled out of the cracked egg, tripping immediately upon exit. His blue little eyes seemed to well up with tears, and he began to bawl. Kestrel, confused and nearly finding herself snapping at the ground for harming her dragonet, scooped him up in her arms. He sniffled, looking up at his mother. His light blue eyes stared into hers, and for several moments, there was silence. He snuggled himself in the safety of the crook of his mother's arm, chirping and babbling to himself as his eyes began to droop. Before falling asleep, he took one look at the bright blue sky above him. Chirping in awe, he tried stretching his tiny talons to the sky itself, as though he wanted it to come to him. He wanted to soar through it the moment he hatched. Kestrel hoped that one day he would get to feel the wind beneath his wings, and the unexplainable sense of freedom that came along with it. This wasn't just the sky, it was his sky. And he was perfect. Kestrel didn't even have to hesitate on deciding his name. Sky the Skywing, she muttered to herself. She knew other dragons would find it odd, but she loved it, and hoped he would too. Sky fell asleep comfortable in his mother's arms, feeling the warmth of the sun radiate off of her scales. Kestrel smiled, looking down at the dragonet she had brought into the world. Sky, she whispered softly, repeating the name as he fell into a deep slumber. And it was perfect. Suddenly, the sound of claws stepping on an eggshell broke the silence. Kestrel whipped her head up, squinting her eyes down at the egg. There's still one more inside. She'd nearly forgotten. Her egg contained twins. There was another dragonet there. An excited Kestrel walked over to the remains of the egg, keeping her precious cargo nestled safely in the crook of her arm. She felt excited and anxious at the same time, and eagerly brushed away the remaining pieces of eggshell. Looking up at her with bright blue eyes was a much larger dragonet. Her scales were a dark shade of red, a great contrast to the pale coloring of her brother. They looked different in every way possible, yet she still loved her. Reaching down, Kestrel opened her talons to hold the nearly born dragonet. But instead, as soon as her talon touched her scales, she was met with a fiery burning instead. Hissing in pain, Kestrel recoiled. The dragonet frowned, a puzzled expression strewn on her face. Sky jumped back in response to the sudden movement of his mother, confusedly staring at the dragonet in front of him. She looked at him back, and the two met each other's gaze for quite some time. It was a kind of sibling recognition and immediate love that could never be replaced or replicated in a dragon's lifetime. And yet, Kestrel was confused. There was no way a dragon could do this. She tried pressing the back of her claw to her dragonette's scales. It was met with the same burning sensation as before. And it wasn't just a feeling. Kestrel could see sparks of a flame shoot out at her touch. What in Scarlet's name? Before she could even tell what was happening, Sky happily wriggled out of Kestrel's hold, stumbling over towards his sister. She stared back at him in response with a look of curiosity and awe, when suddenly a grin lit up on her face. Sky mimicked the same expression, and the two ran over towards each other. Kestrel couldn't even so much as shout against the dryness of her throat, for Sky squeaked in pain, falling backwards against the grass at his sister's touch. The young dragon looked terrified as her brother writhed in pain, and stretched out another claw to help him. She didn't even know it was wrong, yet her first reaction was to comfort him, to help him. Kestrel had to intervene before more damage was done. Scooping up the crying dragonette in her arm, she rushed over to the river to try and cool and soothe the burn. At last, it hit her. Her daughter was a fire scales. There was a rare occurrence in the Skywing tribe that was more of a legend in recent years. Stories were told of Skywings being born as twins, but with a catch. One dragon would be born with no fire, and the other with too much fire. Fear was the only way Kestrel could describe how she was feeling in that moment. But in reality, every emotion in the world was swirling through her head. One of my dragonettes is a fire scales. Her daughter looked pitifully confused, looking down at her talons as if they would reveal some answers to what occurred. She squeaked in confusion and terror when she noticed the burned grass beneath her talons. She reached down, picking up a burnt flower she had crushed accidentally. By the time she cradled it in her claws, the entire flower crumbled into dust and ash. And she cried. In fact, cried is more of an understatement. The newborn dragonette wailed, throwing herself to the ground in her despair. Though she could barely form a thought, she knew what she had just done. Her brother was hurt because of her. The flower was hurt because of her. A thought more faint found itself in the back of her mind. What if the world would be hurt because of her, too? Kestrel and her daughter shared the same thought at the same time, though it would never be something either of them would come to realize. From her hatching, she knew she'd become a monster. It was just in her blood to hurt others, even when she cared. It seemed to be even worse when she cared. Kestrel took time to recover from her shock. She eventually rocked Sky to sleep as the sun set for the day, and he tearfully and tiredly drifted off to sleep. But as for other dragonette, she sat there on the burned patch in the grass, and she never got any sleep that night. When she awoke, Kestrel found herself reevaluating the situation. Judging by the dark circles under her daughter's eyelids, she reasonably assumed that she had either cried herself to sleep or couldn't find comfort in the darkness at all. She eventually settled on the latter. But one thought came to her mind whenever she remembered the horrors of uncontrolled fire scales she had heard as campfire stories in her youth. This was her dragonette. When focusing on the initial fondness she felt when she remembered there was another dragon in the egg, or when her eyes met Sky's for the first time, Kestrel found herself feeling love towards her dragonettes. She didn't care if one of them was without fire or the other too much. They were hers, weren't they? And that was enough. She doesn't have to live a horrible life, Kestrel reassured herself. After all, the sky is her home. It's the only place where Skywing can be free from this world, free to make his own choices and go wherever the wind takes him. I would give anything for my dragonets to feel what it's like to soar through the clouds for the first time, basking in the sunlight and feeling the wind beneath their wings. The thought reminded Kestrel of her childhood, and when she only had brief moments like those. But every Skywing had to experience soaring through the open sky at least once in his life, otherwise he could hardly be considered a Skywing. By this point, the Fire Scales dragonette hobbled over towards her mother after a reassuring nod. Though she couldn't hold her like she could Sky, she could still have her sit by her side, feeling the warmth radiate off of her scales. And that was the second night of their lives. Sky fell asleep as close as he could to his sister, greedily taking in the wondrous warmth she provided. Kestrel thought of it as oddly poetic in a way. Sky was without fire, but found it in his sister. He found the thing he was lacking in his family more than ever. And Kestrel delighted in that fact, smiling at the thought. My family. Though she had never had much of one herself, she promised things would be different. Ever since she had mated with the mysterious orange Skywing, she found hope in the fact that maybe, just maybe, she could change things for another dragon. And here, sleeping peacefully underneath her wing as the rain fell, were the two dragonets she needed in her life most. And things were perfect. At least for now. Because, unbeknownst to both Kestrel and the sleeping dragonet twins, an enraged Scarlet was furious at the disappearance of Kestrel and her egg, and she had a feeling there was something the bitter Skywing was hiding. Kestrel tried to move after the third day, that way her, Sky, and his sister could begin to explore the world. They had already seemed curious, babbling excitedly to each other in a language she could only define as sibling talk. Though they were speaking nonsense, the other would nod their head eagerly as though they understood. She found it humorous and adorable, to say the least. Kestrel found a spot under a cave overhang towards a split in the river. She often caught Sky looking up at the bright blue sky above him with wide eyes, staring in awe. His sister took delight in anything he found interesting, though primarily played in the river and practiced catching fish in between giggles. The only reason why the Firescale's dragonet found the river as her safe place was a given. It was the only place where she couldn't hurt anybody. It was the only place where she was free. The oppositeness of Kestrel's dragonets was shown from the very beginning. Sky was a pale, small, and giggly dragonet. His tiny wings seemed to twitch whenever he looked up at the sky, his bright blue eyes the color of the softest ocean waves. His sister was quite the opposite in nearly every possible way. Her scales were a striking red, and she stared into things with her dark blue eyes with a fierce and determined look. Instead of dreaming of soaring through the sky like her brother, she instead wished to swim in the river forever. Seeing the fish bump into her scales without so much as flinching at her touch was her favorite thing in the world. And she was happy there, deep below the surface. Whereas Sky wished to fly out into the open air, unfurling his wings for the first time. And yet, the two got along together perfectly. Kestrel couldn't have smiled more at any thought in the world. But she still found herself frowning at the idea that her daughter didn't have a name. It was so easy for her to name Sky, but she faced quite the challenge with her fire scales. No name in the world seemed to fit, but she was determined to find just the right one, no matter how long it took. Scarlet paced angrily back and forth, scraping her talons against the cold, stone floor of her throne room. Smoke impatiently shot out of her nostrils, her tongue flicking in and out of her mouth with anxiety and rage. Before she could take out any of her anger on the disturbance surrounding her, Messenger Skywing burst in through the throne room door. "I have a message," she shouted, out of breath. "What is it this time, Falcon?" she snapped. "I've already gotten false leads about where that traitor could be hiding, and all of them have done nothing." "I know, my queen, but a dragon that works along the riverbanks swore he saw dark red Skywing making her way across the river." "Do you realize how many dark red Skywings there are?" Scarlet shouted, nearly toppling Falcon over in a rage. "Yes, my queen, I know," he continued. "But this time's different. He saw her with two dragonets by her side, unmistakably newborns." What did he say they looked like? One was a darker shade of red, though not as dark as its mother. There seemed to be a sort of steam or smoke grating off of her scales, but the fisherman wasn't quite sure since he did see them traveling from a distance. The other was small and pale, no doubt the run of the two. He just knew something looked off and had to report it in. A look of delight fell upon the Skywing Queen's face. "Yes, I think I'd better go on the scouting mission myself. If this really is Kestrel, I want her head on a spike." "Yes, ma'am. I'll gather up one of your troops this instant," Falcon replied, dashing out of the room to the soldier's housing. Scarlet grinned mischievously, then turned to a confused and terrified servant by her side. "They always told me your egg was cursed. The hatchery guards insisted on the matter, in fact. They swore they heard a fiery hissing come from the egg late at night, and none of them dared to touch it, worried for what they might find." "Wait," the servant began. "Do you think Kestrel's egg could be a fire scales?" "There's reason to believe so, my dear. If this is the case, I have myself a dragonet to train." "Why, if I have permission to ask, my queen?" "Do you realize how much power I can get from a fire scales? I know every queen since the age of Darkstalkers killed off any fire scales after those unfortunate incidents. But instead of fearing the unknown, I choose to embrace it, to mold it to whatever I want. A newly born dragonet is easy to control, don't you see? She can become my champion." The servant uneasily stepped back against the stone floor, distancing herself ever so slightly from the queen. And soon, Scarlet was on her way to capture the fire scales herself. The only thing was, Kestrel wasn't aware she was now a convict, and she had no idea Scarlet was on her way. Kestrel left Sky and his sister alone for the first time in their 4th day. Even though they could not understand her words, she reassured them about how things would be okay. And frankly, Kestrel wasn't worried. They had each other for safety, and that was all that mattered. The skying mother soared off into the air, an amazed Sky watching on as she flew. And eventually, she became smaller and smaller in the distance, till she disappeared amongst the trees. And they waited for their mother to return, but not with fear. They knew she would come back. Kestrel knew she couldn't stay off the radar forever. She didn't even know what possessed her to steal the egg from the hatchery anyways. Well, she wouldn't consider it stealing, since the egg was hers. In fact, she didn't remember much from that night that was full of emotion. Perhaps it was panic at the thought of Scarlet finding out she didn't wish to raise her dragonets in the palace. Or maybe it was the anxiousness and excitement of seeing the life she would bring into the world, and wanting to be there to see their eyes open for the very first time. Whatever the case may be, Kestrel didn't regret a single thing she had done. Each day where they don't have to live under the terrifying rule of Queen Scarlet is a day where they can be free. She originally respected the queen of her tribe back in her soldier days. She proudly served on the front lines for Scarlet, obeying her every command without question. At least, that was how she was raised to be. You will die for your tribe someday, Kestrel, her father used to say. And you will die happily, knowing you contributed to a cause far greater than your pathetic self. Whether it was that coming-of-age urge to rebel against her late parents' wishes, or that she had finally begun to think for herself, Kestrel didn't know, nor did she want to. After hearing all the stories she was supposed to be proud of in which Skywing Queens ordered the killings of any eggs they assumed to contain a fire scales, Kestrel found herself being paranoid that her egg of twins may suffer a similar fate. After all, eggs containing twins seemed to be the primary target of those attacks. Maybe that was why she had stolen the egg. The natural feeling of motherly love unconsciously told her that her dragonets needed to be saved from a dire fate. But there was no true way of knowing, was there? Perhaps it was magic, or something far more natural. Kestrel didn't like to think about what she couldn't control, so she stayed away from those thoughts. Whatever guardian angel had urged her subconscious to protect the egg did well, and she wouldn't question it further. After some flying, an exhausted Kestrel stopped on a mountain's ledge. What had even been her purpose in traveling such a distance? Risking the safety of her dragonets? To put it simply, food. Skywings could survive off of fish and berries, but they hungered for real meat. And so, she wishes to fly to one of the highest mountains and catch the greatest flying meal she could find. She wanted that to be the introduction to the real life of Skywing, not just some fried fish by the riverbank. Kestrel, feeling the wind whip at her scales, found refuge near the top of a mountain. And it was beautiful. Every bit of her wished she could take Sky up to see the view. However, he was too tiny and feeble to make the flight at only a few days old, and part of her feared he may never have the strength or wing power to make it up to this altitude. Still, she breathed heavily and laboriously, admiring the beauty of her kingdom. The future home of my dragonet, she thought to herself. If I can change the world to make it worth living in. In all honesty, every dragon in Pyra knew that things were nearly beyond repair. With all the talk about alliances, traitors, and the 3 sailing queens, Kestrel found herself in the middle of it all. Moments like these were where she could sit back and appreciate the natural beauty of her home, or some of the greatest times. She needed to bring Sky up here. He would love it. After having caught an eagle, she sat on the top of the mountain, spending more moments admiring the beauty of the scene. Even with her naturally sharp hearing, Kestrel couldn't hear the wing beats head in her direction until it was too late. Off the distance, she finally heard it. Dragons were coming her way, and a lot of them. Whipping her head around in a panic, she saw a sight that made her stomach drop. Queen Scarlet of the Skywings was headed straight towards her, fury and madness in her eyes. Right behind her was nearly 24 Skywings hot on her trail, and they were headed straight towards Kestrel. A million thoughts swirled through her mind at once. How did they find me? Has she already found Sky and my daughter? Before she could even think, Kestrel took off instinctively. She flew as fast as she could, the eagle still held firmly in her jaw. She felt her teeth sink into it ever so deeper than before, wishing it were Scarlet's neck. But the faster she flew, the more they seemed to catch up with her. And in that moment, Kesha made a decision she knew could either save her life or ruin it. She went back for her dragonets. Though she'd only made the choice in a split second, it was, nonetheless, well thought out. She chose to flee with her dragonets and be safe, by some miracle. Her life would be saved. Though Kestrel refused to admit it to anybody, even her own subconscious, deep down she knew that she needed Sky and her daughter. They'd only been on this planet for not even 4 days, but they'd already proven to be the greatest things that had ever happened to her, and she couldn't lose them. But if she left, both would be without a mother, and she would be surely captured. But there wouldn't be a risk of them getting caught and killed by Scarlet in her rage. Ultimately, she let what she would call greed make the decision for her. She needed them. And so, Kestrel flew right back to where she had left her dragonets. "I'm coming," she said to herself breathlessly. "I'm coming for them." Dropping the eagle she had caught in order to prevent it from weighing her down, it fell hundreds of feet to the ground, rotten and dead. Little did she know, it had quite the symbolism for what would soon come. And now, we cut back to where we began. Penic Kestrel is flying back to where she left Sky and the dragon we know as Peril. Except, she doesn't have that name yet. What mother would name their own daughter after something so terrifying, especially when only part of her sees her as a monster? Wait, did I say part? Because, in a dragon's mind, safety comes first. Because Kestrel knows the danger that comes with the fire scales, what other choice should she have? But I digress. Finally, after nearly an hour of the chase going on, Kestrel saw Sky and her daughter off the distance. A glimmer of hope shot through her, and for a moment she ignored the angry shouting of the guards. They were okay. That ounce of hope, even in only seeing them off the distance, was enough for the Skywing mother. With a new sense of enthusiasm, she took off even more against the strong blow of the wind. Eventually got close enough that the twins saw her, beaming up the speedy figure of their mother. But something was off. She wasn't alone. Kestrel nearly collapsed onto the grass, not caring for a graceful landing. Immediately grabbed a confused Sky and held him tightly in her arms, and stood in front of her daughter defensively. Eventually, Scarlet and her troop landed on the river bank right in front of them. And there she was. The Skywing Queen loomed over her, hissing furiously with irritation, but also delight? "Kestrel, how lovely it is to see you again," she began, stepping closer. Kestrel flinched in response, growling low. Found herself holding Sky tighter and moving her leg closer to the Fire Scales dragonet. "Why are you here?" "What, there's no time for a reunion?" Scarlet egged on. "After all, you've been a missing convict for what, 4 days now?" Kestrel furrowed her brow. "Convict? Surely taking your own egg out of the hatchery a day before it was going to hatch wasn't a crime. The Skywings were known to be family-oriented and loyal, although it wasn't something they often displayed to the other tribes, especially in her lifetime. I am no criminal." "Oh, but you seem to have broken the Skywing law. Didn't you see the bulletin right outside the palace gates?" Kestrel immediately knew what Scarlet was pulling, and felt an overwhelming sense of rage at the thought. She had changed the law to format her desires, knowing full well Kestrel would have no way of knowing of the change. It is now considered illegal for an egg to be taken out of the hatchery unless permission is given from the Queen, i.e., me. Scarlet smirked, taking great pleasure in the look of disgust and anger shown by her adversary. "What? Surely you would have known, being one of my highest-ranking generals and all," she teased. "Oh, wait!" Scarlet out with mock suspense. "You escaped from the palace, didn't you?" Kestrel hissed in response, smoke coming out of her nostrils. Scarlet, looking bored, glanced down at the 2 dragonets. She ignored Sky upon first glance, simply analyzing as being small, weak, cowering, and nothing more than a tool to be manipulated and stepped on. But rather, her focus was on the fierce newborn next to him. The description given didn't miss a thing. She stared at Scarlet with such intensity that it almost seemed as though her stare could burn a dragon just as much as her scales. And then looked back up at Kestrel, who noticeably tensed her muscles. "I'll give you one chance, Kestrel," Scarlet began. "You either kill the small one and allow me to take the other, or you can try and defend them both, fail, and die a miserable death as I pry him out of your talons in your last moments of life and drown him myself." At the look of her shock, she continued. "So, what'll it be?" Fear encapsulated every muscle in her body. Kestrel stood there stunned. She knew Scarlet would be cruel, but she never imagined this from the queen she once respected. Or perhaps she was confusing fiction and reality, the stories her parents made her believe about the queen versus the living, psychotic, murderous one standing before her. And in truth, it felt genuine, raw fear. But not for herself. For them. Sky was terrified, squeaking and trying to hide himself from Scarlet's gaze. Her daughter tried to look threatening, but she could see the fear buried deep in her eyes. Both of them probably knew that she, as their mother, could save them. She'd done it every time so far, so what would make now any different? Except, she wasn't just scaring off a skunk or catching some fish for dinner. She could very well die here, and so could both of them. And she had to act. After a minute's worth of silence, Kestrel said what was expected of her. "I'll kill the small one." Scarlet looked elated and turned towards her guards. "Wonderful! I'm glad this hasn't turned into a hassle. I do hate those." All eyes were on her as she walked slowly towards the river. Its rapids were at an all-time high for the season, and almost nothing was audible over its restlessness. And Kestrel stood on the riverbank, holding Sky in her claws. He looked up at her, managing only an arc of confusion. She couldn't bear to see the look in his eyes. Betrayal. Something she hoped he would never have to experience. She failed to protect him from the first danger of the world. Scarlet impatiently tapped her foot. The guards all stood in silence. And she leaned down to put him near the river's edge. When whoosh! Kestrel spun back suddenly, blowing fire into the face of Scarlet and surrounding guards. They all screamed and jumped back, distancing themselves from the sudden shot of flames. Scarlet ordered her guards to fight back, and that they did. Claws scratched at Kestrel's face, ripping through her scales. But in the frenzy, Kestrel only thought of one thing. Where are they? She had dropped Sky in case one of the guards fired back in response, but she couldn't seem to find his unmistakable pale scales anywhere. But she did see her daughter, trying to fight back against the mob. "No, you idiots!" Scarlet screeched. "We need her!" And then it hit Kestrel. They wanted her because she was a fire scales. Because she could use her. Anger, hatred, and desperation were all in her mind at once. Most importantly, uncontrollable rage. Scarlet tried to take away everything from her. The two dragons that actually brought her happiness and gave her a purpose. And she didn't even care. She just wanted to use her daughter. She didn't see her as a kind soul or someone who was just misunderstood. Scarlet deserved to die for what she had done. Kestrel blew fire into the mob of guards, singeing some of their wings and sending them backwards, howling in unexplainable pain. She knew she wanted her revenge on Scarlet, but it couldn't come today. No matter how much she wanted to do every horrible thing in the world at once to her, she knew that her dragonets came first. When they were safe, she could come back for Scarlet. Then she could know how it feels to be without the one thing she loves most. Her life. Kestrel flew around desperately, scanning every square inch of the riverbank for any sign of Sky. What if he fell into the rapids? What if one of the guards grabbed him by accident? What if Scarlet caught him trying to run off and was going to use him as bait? What if... Her panicked thoughts were cut off when she saw him cowering in a bush, his head tucked under his tail. Tears streamed down his face, and she couldn't help but remember the second time she ever saw him cry. The first time was when he tripped out of his egg. It wasn't real sadness or pain. Just the instinctual feeling of wanting attention from his mother and seeking some kind of comfort in the new world he was placed so suddenly in. But the second time was different. His sister had hurt him. She couldn't shake off the look of terror on his face. It was almost as though her brain flashed back and forth to that moment and now. And it was awful. Kestrel was overwhelmed by the memory and everything going on. She bent down and cradled him in her arms, whispering reassurances about how everything was going to be okay. Once he was safe, she went to go find her daughter, who was bravely taking on the guards. They all stood back in shock, not wishing to go near her after seeing the severe burns she had left on some of the others. "What are you doing, you idiots?" Scarlet roared furiously. "Grab her and go! I want to have Kestrel myself." Still, they refused to move, terrified of what might happen if they touched the defensive dragonet. While everyone saw fear, Kestrel did it first. Still shrugging with the flashbacks of their first night together, she did what she never thought she would. She grabbed her. The burning from her daughter's fire scales brought about tremendous, unbearable pain. Kestrel soared into the sky as fast as she could, leaving everyone dumbstruck as she took off. The moon burned, burned, burned! She could feel the fire blistering through her scales, lighting the tender layer of skin on fire. And as much as she tried to hold on, she felt her consciousness flicker out for just a moment. But that was all it took. Her daughter slipped out of her claws into the rapids of the river. Kestrel only got one glance at the horrified expression on the dragonet's face. Before she could even react, she plummeted down into the river. As much as she thrashed around against the current, the rapids sunk her down beneath, and she didn't come back up again. An inescapable sense of dread took over her whole body. She wanted to shout her daughter's name, but then the thought suddenly hit her. She didn't have one. The dragonet died without a name, a feeling of injustice sending chills down her spine. It wasn't fair. It wasn't right. And as for Scarlet, she was furious such a valuable aspa had been drowned in the river. Wasted potential. A wasted champion. But all Kestrel could do was hover midair, looking down into the river until she couldn't make herself look into its inky depths any longer. Sky began to cry, reaching his tiny claws towards where he had last seen his sister. Kestrel found her own eyes tearing up and looked away. She flew off into the sky, but without that longing sense of freedom. She flew with an inescapable sense of dread that no altitude or view of her home could change. The sky didn't even feel like her own anymore, and she hated that this was the first glimpse of it Sky would ever get to see. Part of Kestrel died that day, but there was just 1 ounce of hope that stayed with her. She's strong, she reminded herself. But the reassurances she provided to her own sense of longing didn't do much to improve her mood. Kestrel did the one thing she knew how to do best, and that was to fly. She flew far away, cradling Sky in her arms. This can't be the end for her. It just can't. Kestrel couldn't bear to see the look in Sky's eyes as he reached out his talons, grabbing at something he could never reach. But there was a hopeful twinkle in his youthful eyes. Does he know something I don't? She brushed off the thought. He's just a dragonet. He can't know anything. We both saw her die. So why does he seem so optimistic? It was a mystery Kestrel would never be able to uncover for quite some time, if even at all, but she continued on, flying off into the sunset, as the sky switched colors to dark lazur blue, and she cried. With the love of the river comes an understanding of the river. The Firescale's dragonet's eyes shot open suddenly. She looked around her, the rush of water stinging her eyes. But she continued on, kicking at the ongoing rapids with as much force as she could muster. She felt her vision becoming darker as she swirled around in a frenzy, confused and afraid. Before her eyes finally shut, she caught a glimpse of a glowing crack leading towards an underwater ravine. It was so bright. She recognized the sight. It was something she had noticed while playing with Sky in the river the day before, and both of them had looked at it as though they were in a trance. Her eyes began to slip closed, but not before she felt the comforting embrace of a dragon reaching out and putting her in their arms. Though she couldn't understand the mysterious aquatic dragon, she knew this wasn't her mother. It was somebody else. She couldn't fight back against their hold, and eventually her entire world became dark. Aurora listened in as the elders spoke in a frenzied whisper. She could only make out bits and pieces of the conversation, but didn't risk getting any closer to avoid being discovered. Do you think she's one of us? She can't be. There hasn't been a fire scale in centuries. They've all been killed off before being hatched. How could this one survive? Fire scales. Third brought about a sense of hope in the Icewing seeming dragonet. Was there truly a fire scales alive today? If so, could she meet her? Aurora had dreamed of the day of meeting a dragon like her. She had a gift. That was what everyone else in her tribe considered it, but certainly not her choice of words. It was more like a curse. Having been born as a seeming Icewing hybrid, all Aurora knew was the depths of the ocean hiding beneath the river. The underground lake system had been enchanted hundreds of years ago by mysterious animus, or at least her family had assumed. Generations of dragons dwelled down in its depths, nearly all of them seeming Icewing hybrids. But Aurora was different. She was of frost scales, and that was her curse. She was destined to live forever in solitude, hiding out from the world she so desperately wished to see. But maybe this dragonet, whoever she was, could be her way out. If another dragon like her really did exist, could they escape together? All she wanted was freedom, and she knew the sky could give that to her. And soon she would come to realize that all the mysterious Firescale's dragonet wanted was family, something that Aurora could give her. But the two were different, and not just in appearance or abilities. One was destined for the sky, and the other for the ocean. Peeking through the underwater doorway, she looked into the room where the elders were crowded in. Because of the strange animus enchantment, some rooms were free of the water. Some were like pockets of air bubbles beneath the surface, and it was magnificent. Though she had only caught a glimpse of the unconscious dragonette lying on the middle of the coral floor, she knew this dragon was her destiny. But neither the 2-year-old Aurora nor the newborn Firescales knew it was to come. An adventure so perilous, it may even become her own name. Anyway, that's pretty much it for this video. I do plan on writing a part 2 to this, in which we follow the journey of Aurora in peril, and there's a lot in store for this project. There'll be action, suspense, and maybe even the reunion Kestrel and Sky have been waiting years to have, with the dragonette they both had thought dead. But there's more than meets the eye to this mysterious ocean world beneath Pyra. Will Aurora and Peril find their own sense of freedom and free themselves from the chains of stigma that bind them, or they suffer beneath the current, longing for a better life? I'm honestly super excited to start working on this project, and I hope you guys will like it too. Like I mentioned at the start of the video, I'm going to be making some huge changes to the Wings of Fire story, creating something no one has ever seen before. Let me know what you guys thought about this what if. What was your favorite moment? Let me know down below. Anyways, thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye!